Good afternoon, and thank you ever so much, Paolo and Karin, for such warm words and such a good introduction to us this afternoon. I'm honoured to have been invited to speak at Birmingham University by my dear friends Paolo and Karin. In many ways, this is the most apt setting for the formal launch of The Epic of Sumanguru, a book which was edited with my co-presenter this afternoon, Valentin Vidrine, who's with us virtually, and in a series edited by Jan Janssen, who is also very kindly come to speak with us this afternoon as well. First, it's apt because, as has already been alluded to, Paolo was my supervisor here, and indeed before that, when I was a student, first of all a history student at Birmingham University, I did courses with the Centre of West African Studies and was kind of enticed away from that into doing a PhD. But while we did courses together, Paolo introduced me to the Epic of Sunjata, maybe in 1982, 83, that sort of time, so quite a long time ago, but he was the first person to mention it to me here. A second reason is because close to this site was the old university library, and it was in that library a few years later as a postgrad student, a doctoral student, that I first came across a reference to an Epic of Sumanguru. Now, ironically, it was in a dusty old tome by a guy called Maurice Bowrer, who I think probably very few people read nowadays. Certainly, if he's read at all by Africanists, or remembered at all by Africanists, it's actually for doubting that African cultures produced epics at all. Yet he did note an exception in this case, an epic poem about Sumanguru, which Albert Lord had told him about. Albert Lord, of course, famous as being Milman Parry's co-worker in Yugoslavia at the time. Now, I was startled and my interest was piqued by this. It was actually quite rare at this time to find even Sunjata mentioned in standard works of epic literature, let alone Sumanguru. And so I set about tracking down the obscure Serbo-Croatian text from which this reference that Bauer had quoted from. Now, failing to find more than tantalizing snippets of this particular source, I set about trying to source the epic myself, find out about it myself, and actually record a performance of it. And the product of that research is what's now being published and we're celebrating and launching today. So, in my talk today, I want to explore how African epics, or at least Manding epics, such as Sunjata and Sumanguru, can function as sites for dialogue, discussion and interplay between a culture's constituent parts, and to propose that we understand oral traditions such as these as flexible toolkits, deployable to furnish political commentary, to advance status claims, and to promote, in some cases, socialization. So, we'll move on. The existence of Manding culture in the UK is actually very little appreciated, I think. So, I think that's partly, obviously, down to the fact that it was colonised by the French and now is part of the Francophone world rather than the Anglophone world. But one interesting way into it is actually the familiarity now today of West African footballers, Manding footballers effectively. These are all from the Manding cultural area, but when I first came across them, they were obscure names that no one had heard of. Nowadays, they're always on the back pages of the press or on the football stories. Kante, obviously, of Leicester City, wasn't it, last year, that he was connected with. So before producing world-famous soccer stars, Manding culture also produced famous griot or jelly like Abdoulaye Sarko, who told the story that we're listening to today, Sumanguru Kante, who's the subject of that story, Sunjata Keita, his foe or rival, Tiramachan Traore, who was another great warrior from the same period, or Balafasake Kouyaté, who was allegedly the first praise singer, first griot. So that's, in a sense, these are the patronyms, the family names that relate to those personages. let's start with the story itself. Here's the teller of this tale. His name's Abdoulaye Sarko. This is a picture of him taken in 1997 when I met him. And let's hear a bit of his story. Sarko places Sumanguru's tale in the aftermath of the decline of the Soninke kingdom of Ouagadougou, which is known in the Arabic sources as Ghana. He describes the hero's miraculous birth. He had two mothers, but bizarrely, he announces his own name. He names himself effectively. He then spends 7 years with the genies, the jinn. These are familiar characters in all of Manding folklore and legends, so they always appear in various guises. Then he travels around the Manding landscape, depositing magical objects at various important sites. Sumanguru is captured, enslaved by a neighbouring king, and only rescued by his sister, Kangu, who braves the taunts and threats of genies to win them over and gain for her brother invulnerability to metal weapons and a golden xylophone, or bala. Now, as luck would have it, you can see an example of a bala or xylophone, a fancy version of which Sumanguru is supposed to have been given, and according to the legend, the first one that was ever played in Manding culture. So, supported by these genies, Sumanguru founds the state of Soso and sings his own praises on this golden instrument, something which is unheard of amongst later kings, and he actually forbids anyone else to play the instrument on pain of death. He's visited, not surprisingly, by someone who wants to break that taboo, a guy called Yankuma Duga, who illicitly plays the bala and escapes instant death only by charming his host, charming his interlocutor Sumanguru with his praises, and he becomes the first griot or jelly in Manding culture. Meanwhile, Sunjata is born. He's identified as a threat by Sumanguru, he's lamed and exiled by Sumanguru, but he returns to lead the neighbouring Maninka kingdom, which Sumanguru has since attacked. For years and years, Sumanguru cannot defeat Sunjata. There's battles and battles and nothing happens. So finally Sumanguru resorts to killing his sister's son and tricking his mother, the son's mother, into pounding the child's head with a pestle. A crime so extreme, so heinous, that according to Manding view, it generates a vast amounts of what's called neama, or a life force or energy, which could then overpower his enemy. So the idea is that it's creating this force that he can then direct against his foe. Unfortunately, his plan backfires catastrophically. His enraged sister goes and tells Sunjata the secret of his invulnerability, and then Sumanguru is defeated. Either he is killed or he vanishes. Okay, so the epic of Sumanguru and the epic of Sunjata, what's the relationship between the two? Well, in a sense, the two overlap and intertwine. They both use very similar parts of the story, only certain things are different. In a sense, you could say the epic of Sumanguru, is an implicit presence within the epic of Sunjata. Certainly, Sumanguru is an essential character in the epic of Sunjata. Their contest is its central drama. Sumanguru has at times been portrayed as an arch-villain, but I think this is to mistake his awesome and fearsome characteristics, common attributes of Manding heroes, for an alien concept of evil. Rather, I think, both Sarko's epic and in the Sunjata epic corpus generally, the two figures are in creative tension, and together they create Manding culture. It's the fruit, you could say, of both of their innovations and their disruptions. I put the map up because we'll talk about some of these places in a bit, and I'll come back to it, but for now that's just enough. These are the questions I want to address in my talk this afternoon. So, why Manding culture remembers figures like Sumanguru and Sunjata? What functions epics about these long-gone heroes What functions do they perform, both today and in the past? And why might, at some times and in some places, Manding storytellers focus their attention on Sumanguru as opposed to Sunjata? This is my argument. I think stories about Sumanguru have been deployed in recent decades in processes of local assertion in Mali and Guinea to reflect local or regional claims for significance. And I'll present evidence that an epic of Sumanguru in the late 19th century reflected upon and commented upon political and religious shifts in the Western Sudan as Bamana Segu fell to Al-Hajj Umar Tal's Tukulor Empire. I'll also put forward a tentative hypothesis that in the past Manding epics were more than simply griot performance narratives and were instead enmeshed with ritual, dance, costumes and masks, and played a role in education, in socialization, and also to some extent in social control. I'll start by looking at two cases of local status assertion employing stories about Sumanguru. And we'll start off with Soso. Okay. According to Manding tradition, Soso is the name of the state which Sumanguru ruled, but where Soso was located is unclear. It's the subject of an academic debate. It's also the subject of discussion in Manding culture itself. Abdoulaye Sako's recitation includes the following lines. Some people look for Soso in Guinea, however, it wasn't there. He goes on to say later, the Soso that Sumanguru got to, it is this very Soso. It is this Soso, the Soso of the district of Banamba. Banamba is there. Kamiko, which is where I recorded the epic of Sumanguru. You can see Soso is just to the south. I don't know whether it's visible to those at the back of the room, but just very close by anyway. So Soso, that's the Soso he was talking about, a village a few kilometres south of Kamiko. And I visited the village when I was there in 1997, and when recording this epic, it was clear that the local population identified Soso with Sumanguru's town and state of the same name. I was shown what were called 3 stone halls, which were in reality more like natural caves, that they were supposed to have been built by Sumanguru. Abdoulaye Sako notes them in his narrative. He built their 3 halls. Those 3 halls, he says, are there. The wind has battered them a lot. I was also shown these 2 trees, the Filaninjala, or twin African mahogany trees, one of which was sadly dying or perhaps even dead at the time. This was supposed to be the site of Sumanguru's coronation, and I was also shown the site of his mother's grave. The angle of the headstone was attributed to pillaging of the site. It's quite a common problem on archaeological sites, apparently in West Africa. So the association of the village of Soso with the medieval state of Soso is dubious. Professional historians certainly are doubtful of the link. Studies of oral tradition suggest the settlement might have been founded about 1900 and also founded by Keita, Sunjata's clan, not a Kante. Most of the population, it seems, are Keita or identify as such, and archaeological surveys have not revealed evidence for a large medieval or an ancient settlement there. The provenance of the grave is unknown to me, although others may know more, but certainly the earliest photo I've seen dates from the 1970s, so it doesn't get mentioned in earlier sources that I've seen. Yet, Sako's narrative does reveal a local use for the Sumanguru epic. It gives voice, I think, to an assertion of significance in the wider historical story of the Western Sudan. It links the village, its environs, its people, with illustrious history of Sumanguru and the fame that accords to that state. And there is a reference to the fact that, others think it was in Guinea. There is, in a sense, rivalry, therefore, over the location. Let's move on to another example, and this is the example of Nyagasola. See whether the internet works. So I've mentioned how Sumanguru was gifted the first bala, or xylophone, and created the first griot from his impetuous visitor, Nyankuma Duga. In Manding culture, he's famous for that role. Sumanguru renamed Nyankuma Bala Fasike Kuyate, and he became the first griot and the progenitor of the Kuyate griots, Manding's most illustrious family of bards. A branch of the Kuyate live today at Nyagasola, a settlement in northern Guinea close to the border with Mali. We can show that on the map. If I can get back there. So Nyagasola is just there on the Guinea side of the border with Mali. The griots from Nyagasola claim today to have the original bala that Sumanguru gave to Bala Fasike. A successful campaign by the griots in 2001 led to UNESCO according the town, the cultural space of the town, the status of being a masterpiece of intangible human heritage. What is intangible human heritage? Well, this is how UNESCO define it. Essentially, they're saying that they back the claim in a sense. The earliest known photograph that may show the Sosobala at Nyagasola is from the 1880s, but the earliest definitive image that I've seen comes from only 1971. Although versions of the story of Sumanguru and the Bala date from the 1930s, there's no actual written assertion of Nyagasola's role in the story known to me before the 1960s. So at present it's impossible to verify the accuracy of the claims that are made by the griots there, but the importance of the artifact and its associations with this particular community is very clear. In the last few decades, leading members of the Kuyate family have become well known to academics and Ghanaian politicians. This may have helped them win recognition from UNESCO. And one can read their claims about Soso as a recentering of the Sunjata Sumanguru story onto Guinea as opposed to Mali, where other prominent bardic centres are located. But it may also be part of what my colleague Jan Janssen has seen as a resurgence of interest in Sumanguru, highlighting his contribution to Manding culture, and as a reaction against the focus on Sunjata and the narrative of old Mali's creation. As Paolo has already referred to, the focus in the immediate post-independence period was on this story, when modern Mali was ruled, of course, by a Keita, a bearer of the same patronym as Sunjata. And one might wonder whether Sumanguru is a better hero for a more cynical age, where perhaps people have fallen out of love with those days. So what we don't have, though, at either of these two sites, that's to say Soso or Nyagasola, is a longer view of their interaction with the Manding stories about Sumanguru and Sunjata. But one site does give us that, and that's Kulikoro. And it's to Kulikoro that I shall now turn. Okay. Kulikoro is a Niger River town about 55 kilometres north of Bamako up the river. This site affords us a more extended example of how Sumanguru's memory and the narratives that embody it have been deployed, as we have some evidence stretching across a 200-year period in relation to the town. Now, Kulikoro is famous as the location of Sumanguru's defeat by Sunjata, pierced by an arrow tipped with a white-cocked spur, the antidote to his genie-endowed protection, revealed by his betrayed sister, Kangu. This is a roadside near Kulikoro today. It makes an emphatic point about the importance of the site in Manding's history. So if you can see, Nyanankulu, here Sumanguru Kante disappeared in 1235. So the scene of Sumanguru's death or disappearance is that place, Nyanankuru. Nyanankuru, or Kuru, is a large rocky escarpment, as you can see here, a rocky outcrop rising next to the River Niger. When I visited, although the sign was not there, the road sign, the association between the site and Sumanguru was very clear, along with claims which linked Sumanguru figuratively to the landscape, the rocky outcrops there, which include these shapes. This one, which is supposed to represent his horse, this one, which is supposed to represent him, and this, which is supposed to be the cave into which I was told he had disappeared. It's also home to a shrine dedicated to his memory, promoting fertility and other benefits. So this was the priest when I visited, and his wife. These are a few quotes from Griot over the years in relation to the shrine. In 1975, even today, people make sacrifices to this place, going there when they are lacking in children. And that association with fertility has been there all the time. Historical records actually prove that the shrine has been in existence at least since the 1880s, when French Marines first based themselves in the town. And there's a record of a British Army surgeon called Dochard who visited Kulikoro in 1819 and left an account that implies that the shrine was already in existence even in 1819, although he doesn't unfortunately mention Sumanguru by name. The German ethnographer and explorer Leo Frobenius also visited in the early 20th century, about 1907-09 time, and he took this photo on the left, and a member of his expedition also made this sketch at the same time. What they show is a monument dedicated to Sumanguru, as you can see, which is basically on the rocky outcrop that's by the side of the river. And it's to this period that we can date Sumanguru's first definitive appearance in the historical record. It's in the travel narratives of two French Marines. Here's images. Two French Marines settled, visited Kulikoro, and were there, stationed there in the late 1880s, early 1890s. Lieutenants Horst and James, as you can see here. Their role was actually to operate and to place gunboats on the River Niger. Here's an example of one of them in situ. The gunboat station at Kulikoro was actually a link in the chain of French military strategy in the second half of the 19th century. The idea was to expand from the Atlantic coast of West Africa up the Senegal Valley in order to dominate the middle Niger Valley, which included the desert-side city, the fabled desert-side city of Timbuktu, and to join French West African territories to the North African territories that the French also had. And Kulikoro had a big strategic value in this as a link in that chain because it was the highest navigable point on the middle Niger, affording access by river to Ségou, to Timbuktu, to Gao, and beyond. So boats like this were hauled overland, I think, in pieces from when they could no longer be brought up any further up the Senegal River, and then rebuilt on the Niger, and then sailed upriver from there, downriver, pardon me. This is a sketch of Nyanankuru by James that appeared in his book from this date. So when they were at Kulikoro, both of these men recorded short accounts of what they term the legend of Sumanguru. A source from the 1920s by another French colonial official claims that he wrote down a long epic of Sumanguru as well, although I've never managed to trace this particular source, although there's still hope, of course, it's somewhere out there. These versions are very unusual. In the big corpus of Sunjata legends, they're very unusual, and they prefigure the epic that I recorded from Sako in 1997. In both of these two accounts, Sunjata gets scant attention, despite his victory, which isn't denied, and the focus is on Sumanguru. His defeat is labelled treachery and a calamity. Sumanguru is associated with Kulikoro's local people. Sunjata is associated with external and overbearing authority. So how should we interpret a tradition that's so starkly at odds with the common rendition of the Epic of Sunjata? And what does it say about how epics might respond to changing power dynamics? Well, I read it as a regional response to and a commentary upon contemporary political and religious upheavals of the later 19th century by the local Bamana griots, which were part of the broader Manding culture. So to understand this, we need to know that Kulikoro was, since the 18th century, part of Bamala Segu, which was a polity led from the Niger River town of Segu, north of Kulikoro, and ruled by Manding culture Muslim warlords who balanced their Islam with simultaneous patronage of non-Muslim traditional shrines or power sources known as Boli. Now, their rule came to an abrupt end in the 1860s through defeat by Al-Hajj Umar Tal's theocratic Muslim Tukulor Empire, which was moving east away from the encroaching French and seeking new territory at a distance from the superior military technology of the Europeans. Al-Hajj Umar's warriors destroyed the traditional shrines and power sources when they conquered Segu, famous for this. Plus their outsider status, most of them were from Futa Toro in the Senegal Valley, and their monopolization of elite roles created widespread dissatisfaction and disaffection amongst the local populace, leading to likely decline in conversions to Islam and to revolts, which eventually killed Umar in 1864. Now, Richard Roberts, who's the authority on this, or one of the authorities on this kingdom, has commented that, quote, the period of Umarian conquest reinforced the marked anti-Muslim character of Bambara identity and served as a means of rallying and sustaining resistance. The French moved in behind Al-Hajj Umar as his state's grip on power weakened, and they finally defeated his successor in the early 1890s, first taking Nioro, then Segu, and then finally Timbuktu off the Omarians. So Kulikoro's narratives about Sumanguru date from this crucial period of the late 80s, early 90s. Their vehement rejection of the successful, but in their eyes illegitimate Sunjata can, I think, be read as a veiled political comment on the Tukulor Empire's conquest of Bamla Segu, and Sumanguru's continued power, albeit beyond the grave, as a positive counter-message to ease the reality of that defeat, and possibly once as a means of rallying resistance. I believe the epic refocused offered a means to describe and convey Bamla Segu's resistance and pride in defeat, an historic label to attach to his opposition to Umar and his invasion, and possibly even as an incitement to revolt that helped precipitate his eventual defeat. Now, if it did perform this role, and at present this is no more than a hypothesis, it would, I think, conform to an apparent wider pattern in the epic narrative's role, which is to say that it's been employed to describe and justify political power relations through its prestige and age. So, for example, we can note that at the same time that the Manding ruler Samori Toure, who dominated sizable parts of West Africa in the late colonial period, the 1870s, 80s, 90s, he described himself as Sunjata returned to earth, according to one source, thereby obviously invoking the epic's story to give inevitability and justification to his own wars. Okay, so I said at the start of the talk that I thought we should broaden our concept of how Manding narratives have operated in the past, and I want to turn to this point now. Two other anecdotes that were told by the French Marines while based at Koulikoro in the 80s and early 90s reveal how Sumanguru's legacy was more than a narrative tradition and actually extended into aspects of a cult with social impacts. One story, for instance, noted how the French had to seek permission from Sumanguru to build on the hill after their first constructions on the site had collapsed. I think these are probably the rebuilt ones, but they may have been the ones that were destroyed by Sumanguru. It's hard to tell. This is anyway the French arsenal at Koulikoro from the time. So permission from and an offering to the shrine apparently were necessary to keep the new building standing, according to these reports. The same sources note that local thieves were induced to return stolen goods on pain of Sumanguru's retribution. Now, both stories suggest to me that the memory of Sumanguru was utilised to regulate behaviour, to support social cohesion, and also, in a sense, to police the inhabitants of Koulikoro, including, in a sense, even the French. A visitor to the settlement from the 1920s revealed that Sumanguru's memory was reflected in what we can identify as Como association rituals. This visitor was the Serbian author Rasko Petrovic, and he describes, well, I'll let you read that rather than me reading it. This is his description of a visit in 1928. Okay, so Como was once widespread in Manding culture. It was a male secret society, or sometimes called a power association, with a role in exerting social control, educating young men, and acting as a quasi-village-level police force and judiciary. Nowadays it's rare, and is best known for its striking wooden headdresses and masks, which are part of awesome rituals and things which are forbidden to all non-initiates, all women and all children. This is an example of one of the Como masks that is in a collection in the United States. And Como and Sumanguru were evidently linked in some way, according to that visit narrative we just saw at Koulikoro. But I guess there's a question as to whether a more widespread connection between the two existed. I think there was a connection. I'll try and explain why. We have obviously limited information about Como Society's activities. They're supposed to be secret on purpose for obvious reasons. But we do know that elements of the Sunjata and Sumanguru stories have been referred to in Como rituals, and the characters in the Sunjata epic contain allusions to Como beliefs and practices. There are references to Como in Sako's epic, for instance. Sumanguru endows 3 Como shrines with sacred objects. He is compared to a hyena, one of the animals figured in the masks of Como, while his bard, in his original name, shares his name with the vulture. Duga means vulture, a bird which is celebrated in a song attributed to Sumanguru and symbolically connected to Como, as the vulture's feathers often adorn the Como dancers' costumes. Now, I'm not the first to propose a general link between the Sunjata epic, and masked dances, typical of Como. in an article back in 2000 published by Jan Janssen, who's with us, he argued that several clues, quote, several clues in the epic refer to masks and masked dances, citing evidence from a range of sources, including Como. The following verse is a song of praise for Sumanguru, in a version by a famous Malian griot, but is also known to have been deployed in Como rituals. It's recorded as having been used in those rituals. Sumanguru himself was revered in Como law. Como associations were almost always led by blacksmiths. Sumanguru is universally described as a blacksmith, and his presence is often alluded to. What is the relationship then between Manding narratives about Sumanguru and Como? I would hypothesize that knowledge about Sumanguru and Sunjata and other characters in these stories was found within the Como or related cults, or societies employing masks and dances more widely than just Kulikoro. Further, I'd argue that concepts associated with Como can actually inform how Manding audiences may have interpreted these epic traditions in the past, possibly today. Those within the Como associations, for instance, may have responded differently to Sumanguru's story than the wider Manding audience. For example, Sumanguru is described in many griot accounts of the Sunjata epic as curtailing free speech. So the griots say that, quote, he placed gourds over the mouths of the poor and the powerful, to quote one of them. This is portrayed negatively in griot narratives as an infringement of people's rights to speak. But in the Como association, of course, secrets are a fundamental aspect of being a good member. They're linked to maintaining power and therefore authority, which is necessary for rulership and leadership. And you could say that Sumanguru provides an obvious lesson in the risks of revealing all. His downfall, as it's told by most griot accounts in the Sunjata epic, but not interesting enough by Sako, is at the hands of a woman who tricks him in the abandonment of lovemaking into revealing the secret of his vulnerability, which is an arrow tipped with a white-cocked spur. In the past, Como had a role as the association that men joined after initiation into adulthood and before marriage. Indeed, Sarah Brett Smith has argued that Como was essentially concerned with controlling sex and procreation, that it attempted to curb the untrammeled and potentially disruptive power of sex by subordinating it to the Como society through its rituals, its obligations, and secrecy, which were intended to override or at least counterbalance duties to kin and marriage partners. So can we read the story of Sumanguru's downfall through sharing secrets with a devious lover as an instance of the epic narrative's employment as a sort of educational example for young men? I believe so, and I think epic narratives served, and indeed still serve, as educational literature in a broad sense. There's much, of course, in Sunjata's portrayal which can be interpreted as exemplary. Sumanguru, as depicted by Sako, can at times be interpreted as a negative example, in particular in his failure to properly value his relationship with his sister Kangu, who is his principal supporter in gaining power and the agent of his destruction. And Sako, you can see in the narrative, repeatedly contrasts Sunjata's supportive and forgiving relationship with his own sister Siga, despite her testing his patience by breaking various taboos and social norms in the story. There's a contrast between the way these two characters are portrayed in the relationship they have with their sisters and how they respond to them. One final piece of evidence suggests to me that the epic narratives could once have been part of a wider performance involving dance and masquerade in Manding culture. And this brings us to a famous author, Ibn Battuta, who's often quoted as one of the earliest sources we have for griots in West Africa. This is his description of Mali's royal court in the 14th century, and he describes a jali, a griot or a jeli today, who sings poetry in which he praises the Sultan, the king, and commemorates his expedition and exploits, playing a balafon or bala, as we've already alluded to over there, made of reed with little gourds under it. So that much is familiar to many of you, I imagine. But this is what he goes on to say. The shula, that's plural for the poets or griots, perform in front of the Sultan, enclosed within an effigy made of feathers, resembling a bird called a shak-shak, which is fixed, on which is fixed the head made of wood with a red beak, as though it were the head of a shak-shak. And he also describes slave boys performing with the chief poet, who are basically dancing drummers and acrobats, doing turns and all sorts of things at the same time as performing. Now, to me at least, Ibn Battuta's description seems intriguingly echoed in Petrovich's account from Kulikoro in 1928, which we've already heard. The enveloping feathered costume, the dancing, the wooden masks in the shapes of birds' heads, and the red beak. Final piece of evidence, or final suggestion. This is a postcard from Edmund Fortier, who was a famous postcard maker from that period. And I think that's valid too.
Taking notes.
Maybe he likes this bit. So this is, it's a postcard. These are Minyanka griot, Minyanka being a part of the broader Manding cultural world, southeast Mali, northern Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire, from about 1900. Well, to me, if you look at the, of course they're wearing big costumes, but look at their headdresses, you can see what to me are clearly bird beak headdresses. And griots aren't particularly, well, there's not been much studied about griot outfits, costumes. I don't think there's much known about it, but my suggestion is anyway that, again, this is quite intriguing to me, the bird beaks on the top of these griot outfits. I think that heroic recitations by griots were once part of a broader ritual performance which include masks, costumes and dance. And I think this is evidence to suggest that. I would suggest in conclusion anyway that the bird represented in the wooden masks described by Petrovich and seen, I believe, by Ibn Battuta as well, was the vulture. It's revered in Como law. It's linked to Sumanguru and an old song called the Duga, which means both vulture but also means the bard, Nyankuma Duga, and also the 14th century Malian king's chief interpreter or griot, Duga. In Bamana, the bird, the vulture, is called Duga. And if you try and work out which bird it is, it's the hooded vulture, Necrocertes monarchus. And if you turn to our old friend Wikipedia, you'll find it described as having a white beak that flushes red when agitated. So, of course, red is the colour of action, the colour of dynamism in Manding thought. So it could simply be a coincidence, the use of red. I wouldn't necessarily say it was more than that. But if this identification did prove to be accurate, it would cement the notion, I think, that at one point in Manding's past, what we know as griots' narratives and Como secret society masquerades were fused into, or perhaps each grew out of, more likely, a single cultural performance sharing common characters and presumably common meanings and functions, and musing on a link between the role of Como and similar power associations in Manding epics. If we imagine a potential educative power of the story of Sumanguru and Sundiata, coupled with the known socializing role of Como in past Manding communities, I think together they could have created a powerful force to forge wider group loyalties beyond family, beyond kinship groups, and jointly, in a sense, foster Manding civil society, and perhaps even helping create the Mali Empire. So I'll leave it at that point. Thank you very much.